Well, hi there. I wanted to come on and continue on reading The Secret Team, starting at page 50. We'll be doing approximately 30-minute session to this evening because that's all that we'll upload appropriately on YouTube without not uploading. Many of these aircraft were lost to Castro's jets, but vast amounts of equipment and some of the planes remained. With the collapse of the invasion, this material was unused. The U.S. pilots returned to Florida with a few planes. Later, the CIA asked the Army and Air Force mission personnel in Nicaragua to gather up and return all of this equipment. These officers were told by the Nicaraguans very politely and firmly that there was not a thing left in Puerto Cabezas. Since it was all black cargo, it was stateless and that it was titleless. The United States never got any of it back, and this was only a fraction of the loss. All Latin American countries keep a very close eye on apportionment of U.S. military, aircraft, ships, and other materials made available to other Latin American states. The formula for the balance of forces is very complex, and this arrangement is a most delicate issue. Other nations soon observed the Nicaragua and has been given a large force supplement of B-26s and C-46s. The B-26s were specially modified and carried much more firepower per aircraft than those that had been given to other Latin American nations. The other military supplies, guns, rockets, and mountains of ammunition were also noted, and the Nicaraguan government would not reveal how it obtained this unscheduled largesse, and the U.S. government could not. The other governments guessed and no doubt knew, but they too played the game. They just kept the pressure on. Needless to say, the government had to make similar equipment available to a number of Latin American countries. The cost of all this, plus the logistic support of this equipment, which goes on year after year, is another of the many high-cost factors that could be added to the total cost of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Again, because of secrecy from Americans, not from the enemy, these facts have remained undeclared, along with so many others over the years. Early in 1960, President Eisenhower had authorized the secret training and arming of Cuban exiles in the United States. Thousands of able-bodied Cubans had fled their homeland, and many of them were dedicated to fighting their way back in and throwing Castro out. Eisenhower's approval was very general and nonspecific. It in no way contemplated anything like the invasion. It was understood that any special operation which would involve Cuba, planned at any time, would have to be cleared by the DCI in accordance with existing directives. This meant presenting the operation to Special Group 5412-2 in what appeared to the DoD as a separate and certainly inconspicuous addiction. A lot of heavy stuff going on right now, so I'm really struggling to try to stay focused, so forgive me. That was inconspicuous action. The CIA began to utilize a portion of Fort Gulick, a deactivated U.S. Army base in Panama. Gradually, a group of Cubans identified in Panama only as Latin American trainees in a military assistance program began to increase in size the activity there. The CIA soon found that this burgeoning camp needed military doctors. In accordance with an agreement between the CIA and the DoD, the agency asked the Army for 3 doctors. At that time, the Army had a shortage of doctors, so it turned down the request for support from the CIA. Then the Navy was asked. It too turned down the request on the basis that Navy doctors on an Army post would be conspicuous and would not fit into the cover story. The CIA did not need flight surgeons, so it did not ask the Air Force for doctors. With these refusals in hand, the CIA made a direct appeal to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and won support for this request. This was the very first covert action in the long chain of events that ended in the invasion of the beach at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. At the time of the request for those doctors, no one anywhere in the government of the United States ever dreamed that the little mound that was being built would ever become that mountainous disaster which finally resulted. It was characteristic to note that the CIA's request was honored and then directed from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and that top echelon, the Office of Special Operations, acted as a liaison between CIA and the DoD. What most people in defense were totally unaware of was that in that very office that was supposed to serve the military departments and shield them from promiscuous requests, there were concealed and harbored some of the most effective agents the CIA has ever had. Their approval of the CIA requests was assured. The amazing fact was that their cover was so good that they could then turn right around the right orders, directing the service concerned to comply with the request. There may have been some mention of the end use of these doctors for the Cuban training program, but if there was any mention, it would have meant little or nothing to those who had not been briefed. The Secretary of Defense had the chairman heard many more such requests during the next 12 months, but the complexities of the veil of secrecy woven by the secret team around the project was such that no one ever saw the whole plan. The use of the control device of need-to-know classification made this possible. As this control is generally practiced, the CIA accepts that a group of men have the clearances after a very thorough review by its own resources and, as requested, those of the FBI. Always in the case of CIA work, this clearance begins at the top secret level. Beyond this, men are cleared for individual areas of information. A man may have a top secret clearance at a north side clearance, meaning that he may be given both classifications of information. However, those in control of north side may decide arbitrarily that certain men may not have some of the information, even though they have the necessary clearance. The control team simply states that those men do not have a need to know, and from that time on, unless they are reinstated, they are excluded from all or part of the project. There are, of course, some sensible and reasonable reasons for such practices, but that is not what is important here. The fact is that this exclusionary process is used as a tool arbitrarily. One way to make sure that there is a little opposition to a proposed activity is to exclude possible opponents on the basis of lack of need to know. Thus, even though the men are in high-ranking policy-making jobs and have the appropriate top secret and other special clearances, they may be kept in the dark about ST plans, and they will never know it, at least for a while. If you saw the movie The Benghazi that I just watched, you'll know that the secret team purposely put those men at risk. Thus, oddly, Stevenson, ambassador to the United Nations at the time of the Bay of Pigs, was not informed about the projected plans until the very last minute, when rumors and news releases appearing in the New York Times were being spread everywhere. Even then, Tracy Barnes, the CIA man sent to brief Stevenson, gave a vague and incomplete picture of the operation. The CIA could, if pressed, prove the OSD and the JCS had been briefed almost daily from the early 1960s until the very day of the invasion. But in spite of this kind of bit-by-bit briefing, it was not until just before John Kennedy's inauguration in late January of 1961 that the JCS got any kind of reasonably thorough briefing. By the time it was much too late. The ST had strong-armed the early Eisenhower authorization of the training and arming of Cubans into an invasion of foreign country during the lame duck period of this administration. And lame duck is in quotations and very important to view. Need to know control can also be bent in the other direction in order to secure the support for potential allies and further those allies' careers. Many members of the team who strongly favored the election of John F. Kennedy over Richard Nixon, played a very special role in the 1960 election campaign, left ear rings. Nixon presided over the NSC and therefore knew in detail the plans that were intended to have been carried out under the earlier Eisenhower authorization. For one thing, he knew that such authorization did not include anything like the invasion of a foreign country. At the same time, it was assumed that Senator Kennedy, as an outsider, did not know these highly classified details. However, he did know in this book, Sixth Crisis, Nixon wrote that Kennedy was told about the invasion by Allen Dulles during the traditional CIA briefing for candidates. But there was more than that to the story too, as it appears. A former staff member from the OSD recollects that during the summer of 1960, he was sent to the Senate office building to pick up and escort the Pentagon 4 Cuban exile leaders, among them one of the future commandants of the Bay of Pigs invasion forces, who had been meeting with the then Senator Kennedy. Those men, Manuel, Artemi, Buesa, Jose Miro Cardona, Manuel Antonio de Verona, and the fourth man, who may have been Aureliano Sanchez Arango, former Prime Minister of Cuba, former Premier of Cuba before the Batista regime, first Premier of Cuba under Castro, and that's who those guys were. Were all supposed to be under special security wraps. They certainly were not expected to be exposed to the members of Congress, least of all to a senator who was close to being nominated as the Democratic flag bearer. However, certain CIA officials had introduced them to Kennedy, thus making sure that he knew as much about the plans they were contemplating as did Nixon. In fact, Kennedy may have learned more than Nixon as the result of his personal meeting, an opportunity Nixon did not have, with the Cuban refugee front and with its American secret sponsors. If you enter into the secret team, you would never leave unless you leave in a body bag. Just to let y'all know. Throughout this period in 1960, Eisenhower had directed the Cuban exiles training and arming to be kept at a low level. He felt that he should not bequeath to the incoming administration, whether Republican or Democrat, any such clandestine operations, small as they were under the limited proposal, which he had approved. As a result, any plans for expansion of Cuban activities were made to appear by the ST to be the Cubans alone. The CIA carefully saw to it that the Cubans had the means to travel to visit such activist headquarters in the American Legion Convention and other avowedly anti-Castro strongholds. As the political campaign picked up momentum, so did the Cuban exiles' activities, with John Kennedy playing a strong, quiet role on their behalf. His support further endeared him to the CIA because the anti-Castro project was their biggest special operation at the time, since the Tibetan and Laotian projects had begun to wane. When the candidates appeared on television together during the crucial campaign debates, Nixon, abiding by security restrictions, which in his case he could not disavow even if he wished to, limited himself in the discussion of the government's plans for Cuba. This official control did not publicly apply to Kennedy, since he had been briefed by Allen Dulles, rigging the election. He could have been warned about security violations, but the CIA can be quite liberal with respect to security when it is the agency's advantage. As a result, Kennedy could and did openly advocate the overthrow of the Castro government, and for the strong position he won popular support for a great number of the voters. Nixon's frustration and anger at Kennedy's calculated tactics were clearly evident on the television screen, as television audiences have learned in the years since those famous debates. When Nixon feels frustration and anger on television, he shows it. And when he felt both during the Kennedy debates, the audience knew it, and Kennedy made points. Many observers believe that the confrontation over Cuba was one of the peak moments during the debates when Kennedy scored most heavily. And of course, most observers credit Kennedy's performance during the debates with his narrow margin of victory in the election. Few knew that his carefree television position on Cuba and in reality Nixon's official stand in time security-bound NSC record. The Kennedy connection with the Cuban refugees before his election was anything but casual or fortuitous, was demonstrated nearly 2 years later. On December 29, 1962, in the Orange Bowl in Miami, before a national television audience at a welcome back celebration for the ransomed prisoners of the Cuban Brigade, before a thundering ovation from the Jam Stadium, the president spoke informally with the brigade and with the tens of thousands of Cubans who came to pack the stadium. At one point during the ceremonies, the president walked among the former prisoners, chatted with them, and then threw his arm around the shoulders of one of them. If those watching in the stadium and on TV thought he had chosen the man at random, they were mistaken. The Cuban he had embraced was his old friend who had visited him at his Senate offices during the summer of 1960, and also at his West Palm Beach home. The man was Manuel Artime, a leader in the invasion. One of the most significant aspects of ST work is its control of operational planning by need-to-know secrecy. And as we stated earliest, earlier, such control seriously limits the level of competency that can be brought to a major operation such as the Bay of Pigs. The CIA never really knew what to do about Castro and Cuba. During the latter days of 1958, the CIA assembled a staff of Cuban experts under the leadership of its old Western Hemisphere Division hands, such as Colonel King. But the real inside man, those who had responsible roles in those operations and in their so-called planning, never discovered. The first somewhat obvious reason usually given is that, of course, those names would not show up because the agency very wisely kept them concealed under proper security. This may be part of the answer, but it is more probable that they never would have been linked with the exercise for two other reasons. First, they were truly faceless and practically meaningless participants in the action. They were in their jobs simply to see that things rolled along. Second, because once such an operation had been briefed to the NSC and the lower middle level of the agency's operations, the support staffs know that the green light is on. They begin to move on in all directions. And from that time on, there was very little leadership. Money becomes obtainable, equipment is made available, travel is abundant, and horn of plenty spills over, and all is hidden in secrecy. Partly by plan, but mostly by the simple fact that no one at the top restrains the action of these activists at the lower levels. Everything begins to happen everywhere at the same time. There's a very special sort of Murphy's Law about clandestine activities. Once they have received an initial and very general approval, if anything can happen, it will. The U.S. government is simply not constituted to become aware of and to control such faceless and random activities as those that take place under the shield of secrecy once the game has been discovered and perfected by the often amorphous ST. Nothing demonstrates this better than the single bitter underlying reason for the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation. The Bay of Pigs effort failed for the lack of effective leadership and for no other reason. It would have worked and it could have succeeded. Everything was there that had to be there. The goals were not so grand and they could not have been achieved: to maintain the invasion force in Cuban territory for at least 72 hours and then to proclaim the free government of Cuba there on that bit of territory. After that, it would have been up to the organization of the American states and the United States to support them, but the Bay of Pigs operation did not have leadership when it was most needed. Dulles, the man at the helm, was not even in Washington. Perhaps he thought the invasion could run by itself. For whatever reason he had in mind, Dulles was not even in the United States at the time of those crucial landings. Interesting. As poorly planned as these over-the-bench operation was, it could have been a success within the original parameters of the effort. Jose Miro Cardona had been told that when the invasion forces had been on Cuban soil for 72 hours, had raised the free Cuba flag on Cuban soil, and had proclaimed themselves to be the new government, he would be delivered to the beachhead. Then, when he appealed for assistance for the Organization of American States, the United States would give his government a free Cuba, the assistance it needed. It was expected that once such a government had been established, albeit of the flimsiest grounds, Cubans would flock to its support, and that once U.S. government assistance was visible and real, such as U.S. warships off the coast, U.S. aircrafts flying unopposed all over Cuba, and even U.S. Marines at the beachhead, then the decay of Castro Cubas would be certain. In essence, this is what the Cubans believed. It may have been what the CIA had in mind as it got caught up in the fervor of training an army authorized by President Eisenhower. However, no one could say that Eisenhower, the tough and experienced commanding general of the greatest invasion force of all time, had ever suggested or approved the invasion of Cuba clandestinely with a force of less than 2,000 Cuban exiles. Whatever the Cuban project had grown to in the hands of the CIA took place after the election day in 1960. The leadership on the beach were competent enough for the job at hand. The Cubans themselves were good. The tactile leadership back in Nicaragua, both for the invasion and for the small airstrikes, was adequate. The substratum of U.S. military personnel attached to the CIA to bring some order out of the training programs was competent, especially the U.S. Marine Corps. Colonel who worked so hard and effectively to see that the little band of Cubans had some idea of what to do when they hit the beach. The U.S. Air Force officers attached to the CIA, who pulled together the small, hard-hitting Air Force of World War II, B-26s and C-46s, were skilled in combat and qualified. But above them, leadership was practically non-existent. No proper official would have approved of the Bay of Pigs operation unless there was a guarantee that Castro would not have been able to give it any effective air opposition. The few close-in, hardcore officers who knew the real plan would never have given any support to the plan if they did not have assurances that Allen Dulles would be able to guarantee that Castro's few combat-ready aircraft would have been bombed out of existence before the men hit the beach. This was the fundament upon which the operation was established. It was its failure that sealed its doom. Before the first Cuban exiles' B-26 attacks on Castro's aircraft, U-2 pictures detailed exactly where Fidel's planes were and how many there were. The first wave of B-26s hit those planes and destroyed them, with the exception of the 3 T-33 jet trainers, 2 B-26s, and a few old British Sea Furies. In modern air weapons system technology, the T-33 is a very low-order combat aircraft, and actually it has very little combat capability. However, it is a big jump better than the B-26 bomber in air-to-air combat. Therefore, until these 3 T-33s had been located and destroyed, there was to be no invasion. The B-26s and the Sea Furies could be handled and ignored. Castro's B-26s were not nearly as affected as the newly modified ones of the Cuban exiles. It had just happened that the 3 T-33 jets had been flown to a small airfield outside of the Havana area for the weekend. The chance removal of these planes saved them from the first attack. The Bay of Pigs instructions called for additional airstrikes to get all of Castro's planes. If this was not accomplished by the first strikes, the prerequisite was simply unnecessary. Damage assessment photos not only showed that the T-33s had escaped, but they showed where they were, lined up on the airfield near Santiago, with the knowledge a flight of B-26s at Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua was loaded with bombs and fueled for the long flight to the target. These were excellent B-26s, which had been modified by the CIA to have a cluster of 8 50 caliber machine guns firing from the nose. This gun pack is most lethal and unsupposed for this type of operation contemplated. The guns could have made mincemeat of Castro's T-33s on the ground. In the air, the T-33s would have chopped them up. Thus, the plan for these planes to leave Puerto Cabezas at an early hour to assure undetected arrival at the target at sunrise and to permit them to sweep in over the airfield with the sun low and at their backs to give them as much ground fire protection as they could get. As late as 1:30 that morning, the CIA agent who was in charge of these plans in Nicaragua had not received the expected message from Washington that would authorize their takeoff, later acting on his own initiative and to keep the excited and ready to go Cubans quiet. He permitted them to start their engines on condition and that they wait for his signal for takeoff. Meanwhile, in Washington, heated arguments had arisen over the airstrikes. There was so much opposition on the second strike that those who sought the authority to release these planes were unable to gain approval. On the one hand, General Cabell and Deputy Director of Central Intelligence and Richard Bizel and Deputy Director of Plans and the man who was responsible for the entire operation were second-level officials. They were unable to release the planes on their own authority, and they were opposed by others, some of whom were the cabinet level. It became a question of who would awaken the president in his Glen Ora retreat in Virginia in an attempt to get his approval. That sounds like Hillary Clinton. Neither Cabell nor Bizel had the authority to do that, and Allen Dulles was not in Washington. At this crucial time when his agency was faced with its most momentous crisis and crisis of leadership, Dulles had left Washington to go to Puerto Rico to address the convention of the Young Presidents Organization. He was the man who could have given permission for the planes to go, or who could have gone to the president himself for that authority. On that fateful night, the CIA were leaderless, the opposition stood its ground, and the airstrike was not ordered to attack the jets at Santiago. This was the key to the failure of the whole operation. Those 3 jets destroyed no less than 10 B-26s, along with some ground equipment, and sank the vital supply ship offshore. Perhaps if one CIA agent had taken a short bicycle ride, the whole invasion would have been a success. The Cuban pilots in those B-26s on the ground at Puerto Cabezas, with their engines running, were on the point of mutiny. They were going to go without a word from Washington except for one thing. The agent who had stole the authority there to release them had told them that Washington was making a last-minute check of the target photographs and that they had better wait until he got the word. They half believed him. Later, his own faith in the system wavered badly, and he knew that as the moments ticked away, the last chance of the B-26s would have to get to the target airfield before sunrise would be gone. After that, Castro's jets could be expected to be gone. Nearby, the agent had a bicycle that he used for his trips back and forth to the operations shack where the circuit to Washington was. During these last few moments, he looked at that bicycle, certain that if he just got on it and rode away toward the shack, the Cubans would go without waiting for his signal. The temptation was great. He had worked with some of those Cubans for 2 years. He knew how badly they wanted the operation to succeed, but his own discipline was stronger, and he did not take the ride. Finally, it was too late. The crew shut down the engines and got out of the planes. Far across the Caribbean, the small invasion fleet approached the shore, secure in the belief that Castro's planes had been destroyed. They hit the beach shortly after sunrise, and it wasn't long before they came under heavy air attack, and they knew then that their time was limited. To add to this tragedy, the same B-26s that were to have wiped out the jets were ordered off over the beach to give the invasion troops some firepower against the ground operations. The B-26s were shot down by those jets, which only a few hours earlier they could have destroyed. And in sunny Puerto Rico, the DCI entered a convention hall to give a speech to a group of young businessmen. This was the kind of elite group he liked. He was at his best among them, and he enlisted their support on behalf of the agency, which was saving the world from communism. Many of those same men have since traveled throughout the world on matters concerning business, wearing around their necks the marks of the agency, the shoulder strap of a new camera. These same men eagerly went from country to country as special agents for the CIA, but then the chips were down and those brave Cubans had been landed on the beach by the CIA. Dulles was not there. He was prepared. He was perhaps the one in Washington, had he been there, who could have sent those bombers out that morning for the purpose of destroying Castro's jets. However, he was not there, and he killed people. A lot of inside buying. A lot of good men gone. Both sides. And that's your United States of American government that you think is a democracy, that you're being controlled and mind manipulated by millennials who've learned skull and bones, by social media screw-ups who have no education, who are trying to teach you how to eat diarrhea juice because they look attractive, you trust them, and they have a siren voice and they do voodoo on you. However, you flock to it, you feed their egos by loving and commenting on their pages, and then nobody says anything. not to mention Hollywood. And if you can watch the Drew Barrymore show and really get something out of it, you need to wake up. If you can watch any of those shows out there right now and think that you're getting something of substance, you better wake up to the fact that you ain't getting nothing. From news broadcasting to television shows to the movies they're putting out. Not only are they destroying the people, such as actors, male actors, but they're destroying the male persona, attempting to at least. Washington is doing it. And then it stems all the way down to the bottom dwellers who want their welfare check. Because they've taught the dumbest people on the planet, which are the poorest people, because they don't want to get real jobs. They taught them skull and bones. It's Amityville Horror Show. And no one says a word. I'm thinking that we're in a communist government. If you're not American, if you didn't grow up in America, you ain't American. If you moved here as a child and you grew up in America, you're American. Every ounce of thought around America is not about immigrants, which is what Obama portrays in his speeches, does he not? This country belongs to Americans, not Iranians, not Mexicans, and I include Black Americans, but not Black Lives Matter. There's going to be a cold place in hell for your asses. And I don't mean the temperature.